All right, acquisition, second language acquisition. Topic today, it's not really there's not much in the book about it, so I'll add a lot of extra material. So we're talking about fluency. You had a question last time about fluency. We'll come back to that. Talk about, give you a brief overview of different theories or approaches to L2 learning and stages of L2 learning for English. A little bit about pedagogy and language learning and teaching and learning strategies and problems. So, talk to each other for a minute. What are your greatest challenges in learning or using a second language? So by second language, we're talking about something you learned after the critical period, teenager or adult years. Talk to each other for a minute. What are your greatest challenges? All right, so let me hear from you, and you'll have to shout at me. What are some of your biggest challenges in learning or using a second language in L2? Yeah, so I know exactly how you feel. I have the same confusion about Korean grammar. There's so many things I've never seen in any other language before, especially English. And so some of the grammar forms are polysemous. They have multiple meanings or uses. Yeah, it's really hard for us learning that. And it's not just grammar. I mean, it conveys meaning, so it's important. What else? Sure, most of you have experience in an L2. What problems do you have? You have to speak loud. I can't. Proverbs? Are you talking about Chinese? Okay, so by English, proverbs. Are you talking about proverbs or are you talking about proverbial anaphoric reference? Which one? Proverbs, like idioms, expressions, proverbs. Like that? Is that what you mean? Because proverb, similar spelling, proverb is like an idiom, a saying. But in linguistics, say proverb is like a proform for a verb. Things like such, or so, or I told you so, or I should have, where have refers kind of in a proform-like way to a previous expression. So that's what you're talking about? Yeah. So yeah, I think that's unique. That's quite different from Asian languages, right? The proverbial reference. I've got to come up with a better term. That's confusing. What else? Do any of you have language anxiety? Sure. A second language, like this guy, another Itchy Feet comic deals with language learning and cultural issues. So this is an example, maybe language anxiety or language blocks. So today's daily poll question is this. Head on over to the daily poll. Do you have problems like this in a second language? Language anxiety or language blocks. Do you have problems like this? So strongly agree, disagree that you suffer from language blocks, language anxiety like this in a second language. So it's today's daily poll. So head on over there. Yeah, a lot of people in the 4 agree. When it comes to Korean, I would say yeah. Look at the daily poll responses here. Yeah, it's kind of like, oh yeah, 5. 4 or 5. The 4s and 5s, those of you who are learning Korean or English? Because I can imagine English, I know the English is very, very stressful, especially the way it's taught, the teaching culture here in the East Asian countries. And for those of us dealing, like me, we Westerners, dealing with Korean, it's hard for us. Sometimes it seems like there are just some sociocultural blocks with us Westerners learning Asian languages like Japanese, Chinese, Korean, in my experience. Okay, so it seems like a lot of you do. We'll talk about language anxiety a little bit later. So fluency, so you asked about fluency last time. Let's revisit that. Fluency in L1 and then in L2. So in L1, children have kind of basic fluency by age 5 or 6. They're able to express themselves and communicate basic functions. They don't know a lot of vocabulary, but they've got all the basic vocabulary of the language, the core vocabulary, the common everyday vocabulary. They've got that. They've got pretty much all the basic grammar. By maybe age 10, they'll pretty much completely master the grammar of the language. So before age 10, there may be a few unusual grammatical structures, like with English, maybe certain subordinate clause constructions that are more complicated, certain kinds of relative clause structures that are more complicated, and we'll see that later when we look at the L2 developmental stages. And then maybe phonemes. They probably get, depending on the phonemic inventory of the language, they'll probably get most or all of their phonemes down by age 5, 6, maybe 7. But do know for English learners, kids learning English as an L1, what are the last phonemes that they master? Maybe around age 5 to 8 or 4, even maybe. What are the last phonemes to master in English? You remember? So the TH sounds are kind of the second last, usually. I mean, there may be individual differences. So the TH sounds are kind of like the second last. So what's the very last one for most kids, most English-speaking kids? The R, yeah. And so if you're like in Asia and you think, oh, that's hard to learn, well, yeah, it's the last phoneme for us to master. And some kids still have trouble by age 7 or 8, saying W instead of R, and I was one of those kids. So I remember like early grade school, it must have been 7, maybe 8, I don't know, 7. I remember being called out of class and sent to the speech therapist at school, and I didn't understand why I was being sent there, what was wrong. And the speech therapist was kind of old style, doing kind of just boring repetition exercises, and I hated it. And I think at one point I got frustrated, and she got frustrated with me and said, okay, go back to class. You know. But I figured it out on my own. So I'm sure by age 10 I mastered my R. No problem. So a few kids might have developmental delays, but they get it, usually. Didn't really need speech therapy. And hey, I grew up to be a linguist, so there. And in fact, I can say all kinds of R's in all kinds of other speech sounds and hundreds of speech sounds in different languages, including r and r. And I can even do I didn't teach you this, but there's a fricative trill R in the Czech language, like r, r. Like in the Czech composer Dvorak. You know Dvorak, he's a great composer, check him out. Dvorak. I can even do that. Learned that in high school. I had a Czech friend in high school. And when it comes to maybe learning 3 or more languages, yes, with maybe 3 or more languages, there is more developmental delay because, again, your input time is divided among 3 languages. And a lot more code switching, and the adults will go, oh, he's really confused. He's mixing 3 languages. No, they sort it all out. Don't worry. They figure it out, no problem. And there may be tiny, tiny delays in language processing times, but are not meaningful with multiple languages. Let's talk about heritage speakers a little bit. So these are like kids of immigrant families, and they grew up with their home language, which is their parents' L1. It might be Spanish-speaking kids, Chinese families, Korean families that moved to the US, for example. And so someone asked somewhere about sociocultural issues, so this is a good kind of, we're looking at that. I knew a lot of these kids, Korean, Chinese American kids back in the US. So of course they'll be able to understand receptive fluency of their home language. And of course, naturally, they learn English pretty well if they come early enough. They may be thrown into classroom the first day and they don't know what's going on. They don't know the language very well, and it's very stressful for these kids. But because their brains are flexible enough before age 10 to 13, and they just have to survive, and they have to form friends, they learn English pretty quickly. So the question is the home language, like Korean or Chinese or Spanish. How well they master the home language. Well, of course, they're probably going to have like basic communicative fluency in the home language. They'll be able to communicate with their parents and understand the language. The degree to which they master the home language is going to depend on some things: their relationship with their parents, their attitudes towards their parents' culture, towards their original culture. If they have good relationships with their parents, might have a more positive attitude toward the language and culture, like Korean. Especially if the parents are helpful in giving them a bicultural identity. But there could be cultural influences, stresses at home, where maybe they come to resent their parents' culture. Or if they see the two languages and cultures as being in conflict, they won't have a healthy sense of bicultural identity. So if they feel like they're not in conflict and they easily go back and forth, then they'll be more likely to be successful in the home language as well as English. But if they feel like, oh, I have to choose one or the other, they're more likely to choose to identify with the American culture and English language, and kind of neglect maybe their Korean. And of course, their input in Korean is limited to pretty much their parents at home and a few books and Korean media materials at home or in their little Korean community. So they get to high school, college, depending on, again, their identity and how well they embrace their home language and culture, the parents' language and culture. They will still, of course, have received deficient input in, say, Korean, and so they will probably be behind when it comes to reading and writing Korean, and especially behind when it comes to reading, writing, and speaking the formal registers of the language and the academic registers of the language. Now, if they're lucky and they want to, in college, they might be able to take like an advanced Korean class, or maybe a Korean class or Spanish class that's designed for heritage speakers. Or their parents might just say, okay, spend a year in Korea and come in Korean and regain their culture. But I've met a lot of Asian American kids who, I don't know, just for some reason, I don't know if it's their family issues or what, they just reject their parents' culture. Like, I met a Thai American college student, and she didn't care about her Thai culture or didn't speak Thai, and I thought that was really sad. I mean, that's a cool culture and language, come on. So that's where you might, if you're interested in some of the sociocultural issues, heritage speakers are an interesting thing to study. Now, how would you define second language proficiency or fluency? So again, talk to each other for a minute. How would you define proficiency or fluency in a second language? What criteria would you select or focus on? So talk to each other for a minute. All right, let me ask some of you. I think what criteria would you select or focus on for defining L2 fluency? So to what degree can you speak spontaneously without having to think and translate, by the way? If I don't remember later, I need to come back to L2 vocabulary. I need to say something about that briefly. Okay, and how would you measure that? That's kind of a good question. You have to think about how you would measure this or test this with some kind of a inventory or a test. Okay. How quickly it takes to respond. Yeah. So like the Itchy Feet comic, he got stuck trying to translate and getting lost in all the grammar, which is easy to do. What else? What would you focus on, or what criteria would you select for proficiency or fluency? So using for its intended setting, like daily conversation, daily communication, getting by, or as it may be academic context, like taking a class, college class in English, in science or philosophy. And by the way, for heritage speakers, and especially young immigrant kids, there's a little controversy for bilingual education, say like Spanish-speaking immigrants, kids are in school. In schools, we try to offer them bilingual education programs, so teaching them Spanish as a way of helping them to learn English. Because, for example, if you're an immigrant kid and here's like science concept, it could be middle school, here's some science concepts in English, that's pretty hard. When you don't even know the concepts or the words in your first language. And so the purpose of bilingual education in the US, like Spanish classes for Spanish-speaking kids, is to help them to learn the English so they can learn like the academic words and concepts in their first language as kind of a basis for then learning the English words in their regular classes. Like imagine if I were to teach you, oh, let's learn a philosophy term today, existentialism. Do you know what that is? Well, I could explain it to you, maybe. But if you don't know the concept, especially in your first language, it's really hard to learn an abstract concept or technical concept in your second language. So using it for the intended setting, whether it's conversation or academic. When it comes to L1 and L2 fluency, different education researchers will define fluency in terms of reading fluency, morphosyntactic ability, mastery of the grammar, and especially morphosyntactic mastery of grammar. In the old days was kind of a measuring rod for fluency, but then especially in English as a second language education, there was a strong reaction against that because, you know, you can learn a lot of grammar. Like Korean, you've learned a lot of grammar, English grammar in high school. Can you use it? Maybe not, because I hear this from my Korean students all the time. The teachers lectured in Korean about English grammar. And you memorize grammar and you memorize vocabulary, but you can't use it. You had no chance to actually use it in a meaningful communicative context in the classroom. It was sitting passively while the teacher lectured about grammar. That's no way to learn a language. And so there's been a strong reaction against that in language teaching circles and to focus more on actual oral speaking or communicative fluency for conversation, for, navigating the world, getting around, and maybe even for academic contexts. And that's why we tend to focus more on today when we talk about L2 fluency, communicative competence, communicative ability, being able to actually use the language in a real setting. There's also pronunciation fluency, and which is similar to oral reading fluency. If I give you text, can you read it out loud? Maybe more for academic purposes. Prosodic fluency, so not just pronouncing phonemes, but also rhythm, intonation, voice pauses, natural speaking voice in the second language, on top of just pronouncing phonemes. And writing fluency. Do you like the TOEFL TOEIC essay questions? I've heard they're pretty stupid, right? Essay questions on the TOEFL or TOEIC. Yeah, pretty bad test. As a linguist, a lot of linguists don't like the TOEFL or TOEIC. You realize that they're not really valid tests of English. So when English, we talk about ESL, English as a second language, and EFL. So remember like the three-circle model. An immigrant or foreign student who comes to the US to learn English. English is kind of the native language everywhere. So they learn English as a second language. They already speak Spanish or Korean. They learn English as a second language. In a context like Korea, English is not naturally used in Korean society, whether in most homes or in government, business, education. So English is purely a foreign language. So in our field, we kind of make this technical distinction between ESL, English as a second language, like if I'm teaching English to foreign students in the US, versus EFL, where I'm teaching, say, academic English to freshmen here in Korea. That's EFL. So a lot of people who don't know L2 education don't really know this distinction. So anyway, in the education research in English L2 teaching pedagogy, since the 60s or 70s, there's a strong reaction against the excessive focus on grammar in the past, and a debate about accuracy versus actual communicative proficiency or competence or ability or fluency, because you can know a lot of the grammar but not be able to get around in the country or in a real communicative setting. Or you might be able to successfully, ask for directions, get around, navigate your way in a foreign country, say using English as a second language. Even if you make mistakes, grammar mistakes, pronunciation mistakes, can they understand you? Can you get around? So accuracy is not necessarily required for kind of everyday proficiency in a second language. As long as people can understand you, in spite of your accent and minor grammar mistakes. So there's been a shift toward a focus on communicative competence, not just focusing on grammatical accuracy or pronunciation accuracy. But of course, for academic purposes, if you're going to use a second language in college, like here in Korea, Yonggang, or courses taught in English medium instruction courses, you need a good deal of accuracy too in English in order to write papers and do presentations. So there are, of course, legitimate needs for accuracy as well. So there are different groups and organizations have different kind of schemes for classifying students. A lot of language programs will have like a 5-tier classification system, like beginner, intermediate, intermediate, advanced, intermediate, and advanced, or something like that. Or a pretty well-known one, there's a well-known kind of set of criteria. There's one from Canada, the Canadian government. There's one from the European Union, the Common European Framework for Language Ability, and you can search for this online. Or actually, there's a link in this picture of my slide. If you click on it, there's a link to the website that has this. So they call it Basic, Independent, Proficient. So it's an attempt to kind of balance accuracy criteria versus communicative competence criteria. And most of us in the field today believe that you need accuracy, but you need communicative competence. And both are important. And for a lot of students, maybe more of a need for communicative competence. Let's talk a little bit about different theories, and I'll come back to the teaching methods after this. So before Chomsky came along, the dominant theory in linguistics was structuralism, which focused on analyzing the surface structures of grammar of sentences and the phonology without really realizing there's a deep abstract structure going on that Chomsky made us aware of. In psychology, the dominant thing was behaviorism, thanks to Skinner. And so this led to a common teaching method we'll talk about later called audiolingual method, or ALM. Some of you may have suffered under it. We'll talk about it later. But there was a focus on imitation and repetition, thinking that this is how students would learn. A lot of imitation and repetition exercises and grammar exercises in the classroom. You may have experienced that. And again, the focus on communicative competence starting in the 70s was a reaction against the heavy focus on repetition and grammar. But the structuralist view of language focuses just on surface forms, and so that led to maybe two approaches to analyzing kind of what do we need to teach the students, what are the students' needs. So imagine before our modern day knowledge of language acquisition, let's say you're an English teacher in Korea in the 1960s, old days. What would you do? Well, language education was still pretty much informed by the structuralist view and ALM and other older styles. What would you do? Well, one thing you'd probably do is what's called contrastive analysis. Let's say I'm an English teacher in Korea, 1960. Well, what would I do? I would compare the grammatical structures, the phonology and grammar and pragmatics of Korean with those of English, and just compare the two and say, okay, these are the differences. I would contrast and compare the two, all the various structures. These are the big differences. This is what I need to focus on in teaching English to Korean students. I think that's going to be helpful. Turns out it's not, because again, there's a lot of abstract stuff going on in language this is not going to tell you about. You might think, oh, the difference in word order, SVO versus SOV. Do you really need to focus on that a lot? Is that really hard to learn in a language? I don't think so. It's not really such a big deal. Contrastive analysis might tell you it's a really big difference. It's something you should focus on a lot. When probably you don't need to focus a lot on it, it's not that hard to learn, going from SVO to SOV. The third singular S, like she goes, a lot of intermediate and even high intermediate and even fairly advanced learners of English, especially if their L1 background is an East Asian language, still have trouble with this. You can do classroom exercises and they will learn to do it in the classroom. She goes, But then when they have to give a presentation or if they write a paper, they will still revert back to saying she, go. It's a common problem. Contrastive analysis will not tell you that this is going to be a major problem. We don't fully understand why this still is a problem for even fairly advanced and intermediate learners of English, especially from a language background that doesn't do inflection for like first person, second person, third person verbs. So I'm going to tell you that this is going to be a big problem. How about the and a? What do you do with that? Do we understand how the and a work in English? Very few people do. I mean, I think I do. Maybe the last day of class I'll tell you my insights, my research. But how do you do contrastive analysis if linguists generally don't, and especially language educators, don't understand how this works in English? Another thing that might be more helpful is just to do error analysis. And to some degree, we may still do something like this today. You just analyze their verbal productions and their writing, what errors are most common, and focus on that. We might do that today, except it's not really based on structuralism. It's maybe based on more advanced understandings of language structure and learning. But there's more to that than because error analysis is again focusing a lot on phonemes and grammar forms, and you still need more pragmatic and communicative competence too, and that's important. And error analysis might not help you with that stuff. The generative or innatist or Chomskyan approaches, they mainly focus on L1. They don't have, I think, a lot to say that's helpful for L2 learning or teaching. They mainly focus on the L1. What they mainly say is L2 learning is going to be different than your L1. It's going to take more effort, more conscious learning of, say, grammatical principles and forms and practice. And maybe consciously you're doing hypothesis testing. This is one insight. When you're learning in L2, you're maybe forming hypotheses. You mentioned like the different multifaceted grammar forms of Korean. So you're probably forming hypotheses. This verb form in Korean can maybe mean this and this and this. Let's try it. Let's observe. Let's try in conversation. Hypothesis testing. A child does this unconsciously with the L1. You have to do this consciously with the L2. Oh, there's something new, a new word here. What does it mean? Let me pay attention. More consciously thinking about language learning. There's some other debates in terms of applying generative grammar to L2 learning. It's very theoretical, and I'm going to skip it because it's not probably practical for us. Maybe you've heard of Krashen? You heard of Krashen? I heard him talk at a conference a couple years ago. He's pretty good to listen to. He has some good insights on communicative focused language teaching, which are pretty good. He used to be kind of took an extreme position on that. We'll talk about his kind of approach, which is controversial. And today, a lot of language educators and linguists reject a lot of his controversial ideas. They realize that they were kind of quack. Some of his ideas are good. They're just not necessarily terribly original. Sometimes it's more like he was just putting on a name on something that we kind of knew already, which is helpful and valid. So some of his ideas are valid and some not valid. So the first one, which is really problematic, and people just don't accept this today, he tried to make this really artificial distinction between acquisition and learning. So learning is more like what you do in the classroom. You're consciously learning on your own or in a class and practicing and focusing on, say, grammar forms and conscious knowledge of the language. And he, being kind of took kind of an extreme position against the past focus on overemphasis on grammar accuracy. He kind of dismisses that as not valid or useful. Again, he took an extreme position, maybe in reaction against the overemphasis on grammar practice in classrooms. And he says that's not useful. That's learning, but that's not useful. Acquisition is what you want. He defined acquisition as actual learning in communicative contexts and using the language and developing communicative fluency without, learning consciously grammar forms and stuff. It's an artificial distinction. You can't really distinguish the two because obviously classroom learning and instruction, if it's done right, can be very helpful. It's a very helpful kind of bootstrap or scaffold to help you learn the language. So it can be valuable. So he kind of made this artificial distinction in order to kind of devalue classroom learning or grammar learning. And today we don't accept this at all. It's nonsense. He had really no valid research basis for this. The second one, the monitor hypothesis, is you're learning a second language, you're monitoring yourself and you're noticing things. Oh, that's a new word. Oh, that's a new grammar structure. And yes, of course, it's true. But it's true of learning in anything. It's just putting on a name on something that educational psychologists kind of knew already. Natural order hypothesis, again, it's not just his research, but again, I think he's putting a good name on something that we had some research evidence for when he came out with this theory, and a lot of evidence has accumulated in support of it. So in that sense, he's right. More or less, regardless of what your L1 is, when you're learning English as an L2, you will tend to follow a similar order in the stages of development of your learning of grammatical and morphological forms and phonemes. There tends to be general patterns in the stages in which you master the different parts of the structure of an L2. And we'll come back to that later. The natural order. Input hypothesis, where he called it I+1. So, for example, if you're learning, say in a classroom, what you need, this is your current state of knowledge of the language, what you need is something that goes just a little bit beyond that, so you're challenged with something new. Oh, here's some new words, what do those mean? Or here's a new grammar structure, what does that mean? So going one step beyond your current level. It intuitively sounds correct. The problem is, how do you test it scientifically? How do you define what that I is, your what he called interlanguage state? You're learning a second language, so you haven't fully mastered the grammar. You've got what's called an interlanguage. It's kind of a provisional, still developing kind of grammatical knowledge of the language and vocabulary. That's your interlanguage, and then how do you define what that +1 is? It doesn't really lend itself to scientific definition. It also sounds a lot like Vygotsky's concept of the zone of proximal development, ZPT, which is very famous in education. Everybody in education knows Vygotsky. He was a famous Russian psychologist, mid to early 20th century. So here's a student's current knowledge. It doesn't matter whether it's a math class or English class or whatever in education. The student's current knowledge, and then the student needs to be challenged with maybe some input that goes a little bit beyond their current knowledge in the classroom, and guided help or instruction or scaffolding from the teacher or from someone to help the student learn to go one step beyond their current state. And according to Vygotsky, this is going to vary from one student to another. What is that one step beyond their current knowledge? And then finally, if it's too much, if it's out of reach, they're just not going to learn if it's too far ahead of their current knowledge. So critics of Krashen will say, his I+1 sounds a lot like Vygotsky's ZPT. Defenders of Krashen will say, no, it's different. I'm like, they're so similar. And everybody in education knows Vygotsky's ideas. How can this not be based on Vygotsky's ideas? He would have known Vygotsky's ideas somewhere if he's an educator. So I find that really questionable. The last one, affective filter hypothesis. Here he's putting a name on something that we kind of knew in educational psychology. It's hard to learn a second language if you're under stress. Maybe you had a fight with your parents, or maybe you resent the language and the culture that's associated with it. You hate the way it's taught very boringly. You hate the teacher, you hate the class, you don't like the language or the subject. Motivation and attitude problems are going to hinder your language learning. And that's something we've known for a long time in educational psychology. So he's really putting a name on something that we kind of knew already. But it's true. So they mainly talk about motivation and attitude. So we'll talk about motivation a little bit later too. To that, I would also add the issues that we talked about: cultural identity, social motivation too. Are you socially motivated to learn the language? If you identify with the culture, do you want to be a part of the culture? Stuff like that. So I would add that to what Krashen calls the affective filter hypothesis. And it's really true. Motivation, attitudes, and these other factors can really hinder language learning or enhance it. Some other theories of language learning, connectionism we'll get into next week when we talk about psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics. It's relevant to L1 and L2 learning. Transfer hypothesis, this is a common hypothesis, something we talk about. The mistakes you make in a second language may be due to you transferring a structure or something from your first language into your second language. And you make mistakes because the first language is getting in the way. That's called negative transfer. There's also positive transfer. If something is similar, then naturally between your L1 and the L2, not much is similar between English and Korean. Can you think of anything? Well, you've got nouns and verbs, that helps. That's similar. The languages are so different. It's just hard for me to learn Korean for that reason. So if there's some point of similarity, that's going to be positive transfer. That's where the L1 can actually help you. But the problems come when there are differences, and you might say make mistakes in the L2 because of influence from the L1. And there's a whole lot of research literature on that. And when it comes to vocabulary, grammar, pragmatics. Interaction hypotheses, I won't get into this much, but some people more focus on the role of social interaction in learning a language, and some people focus on individual differences. Learning styles. Now, you may have heard of learning styles. Some people are visual learners, and some people are auditory learners, and some people are kinesthetic or movement-oriented learners. The research shows that there's really no scientific evidence for that, although people do have learning preferences. You might prefer to learn from written word or from hearing something. What the research shows that, for example, in a classroom setting, combination of both visual and auditory input are most helpful for learning. But there's no scientific basis for actual learning styles or teaching differently according to students' learning styles. Intelligence may or may not be helpful. Not so much intelligence itself, but if you just have a verbal ability, a verbal thing, that can be helpful. But intelligence is not always a predictor of L2 ability or success, because some smart people, maybe they're shy or introverted. Well, personality. If you're extroverted, congratulations, research shows you have an advantage in learning an L2 because you're more likely to practice and seek out opportunities for practice. Whereas those introverts who are saying, I'll just learn a dead language like Latin, I don't have to speak. It's easier if you're an extrovert. Motivation, we'll talk about. Identity, we've kind of talked about. Language anxiety, we'll talk about later. So the developmental stages, according to Krashen and also according to other research since then, when it comes to verbs, for example, people tend, in learning English as a second language, they tend to follow in this order, mastering progressives in B, and then auxiliary verbs, and then irregular past verbs, and then things like the past DD and the third singular S, like she goes, and the possessive S. When it comes to negation, students tend to follow these stages. They just start using no and not, often incorrectly. Then they learn don't, but they don't use don't correctly, like I don't, can, sing. I'm using it with modals and not inflecting it for a third singular, doesn't. And then finally using doesn't for the third singular, but using maybe didn't incorrectly, and finally mastering didn't with the past tense. Question forms. So maybe first they'll just echo nouns or then echo sentences with a question intonation. Then they start to learn to use auxiliary verbs at the front, like do, or WH words like where or what, but not doing the rest of the sentence order correctly, what's called inversion. And then finally doing the inversion properly. And the last stage is going to be learning more complex questions like tag questions, negative questions, and what time is it? Do you know what time it is? It's an embedded question, or a WH complement. A WH clause, like what time is it, is embedded into a main sentence, a main clause. Do you know what time it is? Doing that correctly. Relative clauses for L2 learners learning English. The most difficult ones tend to be possessives, maybe whose, but especially comparative relatives, and maybe also for L1 learners. The person that Susan is taller than is Mary. Now, we don't use it that much, so maybe one problem is lack of input. It's not a common kind of relative clause, I think. But these are the ones that they learn later, and they learn direct object relatives before indirect objects and prepositional objects. So, and there's plenty of research on that. You can look it up if you're interested. Teaching methods. I have enough time here. Good. The oldest teaching method in the West is grammar translation method. And kind of in the analog, there's an analog to it in the East Asian culture too. So imagine a language class where all you do is grammar forms, doing rote or mechanical exercise with grammar and translating sentences. Have you had that? Have some of you learned English that way? Maybe the teacher, your school teacher, lectures about English grammar, and it's all about learning grammar and vocabulary and translating grammar or doing exercises with grammar forms. Have you had a language class like that? It's pretty boring, right? Now, I first experienced it when I took Latin in high school, and it's fine for a dead language because you don't need to learn to speak Latin unless you want to become the Pope or Cardinal or Bishop or something. But this is the oldest teaching method and needs to be dominant in both the West and the East. Where does it come from? It really goes back to, say, ancient Greece. If you were lucky to attend a class taught by a tutor or a scholar, well, they didn't have books. So the teacher had all of his knowledge, and it was his usually, in his head. And so he lectured. Whether there was a language class or philosophy or whatever, it was a knowledge dump, a knowledge transfer kind of learning. You took notes because there are no books, so the teacher dumped knowledge, he lectured on it, and you took notes, and that's how you learn. Focus on grammatical accuracy, but we know that that doesn't work. Then came the audiolingual method, informed by behaviorism and linguistic structuralism. So, a lot of repetition. So it's like some grammar translation exercises, but then there's a lot of repetition. Repeating after the teacher, repeating after a model, repeating together, question and response of the teacher. Do you like swimming? Yes, I like swimming, and stuff like that. Imitation, repetition exercises. Did some of you have that kind of learning experience? And it's pretty boring, right? So one college language class I took was audiolingual, and I hated it. Now, in reaction to that came along two approaches that are kind of similar to the natural or immersion methods. Got some traction in North America, in Europe, not necessarily a lot. So imagine you take a French class. I took a French class in college that was like this, first year French. And from day one, there's no explanation of French grammar or pronunciation in English or in your first language. It's the teacher is just barking at you in French for an hour and tries to use French, and you have to guess what is he trying to say, and keeps trying to teach you pronunciation. Boom, 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 and they never explain anything. Have you had a class like this, an immersion class? Is it helpful? You know, it kind of depends. I think if some people like it more than others. I hated it, but I think it works if you either have some background already in the L2, if you're not a total beginner, it might be effective. If you like that kind of thing, if you're more extroverted, you might like that. Or if the two languages are similar, if your first language is Spanish, you could easily do a Portuguese immersion class, no problem. But for me, doing French beginner, it was awful. It might be more appropriate for intermediate French for me. One time in college, one summer I took this Japanese class. It was weird. It was a weird mix of immersion and ALM. It was weird. So the teacher barking at us in Japanese, I don't understand anything. And then an ALM component was like, we had to memorize these Japanese dialogues in our book, and we didn't quite understand them, but we had to memorize them and then act them out in front of class. Oh, it's like, and after the summer, I forgot everything because there was no meaningful teaching or no meaningful learning to that. I took Korean in classes when I was in college, My first Korean classes were very GTM. I learned really nothing. Then I had an immersion class because most of the other students were Korean Americans. They were heritage learners, and so the teacher taught immersion. I was lost, and I just quit. Communicative language teaching, and it's a variant task-based language teaching, were kind of reactions against that. And saying students need to learn to use the language in real or realistic communicative contexts. So like you do classroom activities that model real-world activities. And especially in TBLT, it's like accomplishing some kind of task or goal, or just any kind of communicative exercise, even artificial ones, but you have to talk. So maybe you did like some kind of a drawing task. One student has to describe a map or a drawing to the other, and they have to reproduce it, or asking directions, buying, shopping, whatever. You kind of simulate these kinds of activities in class. Now the early CLT DLT was kind of reacting against the excessive focus on grammar, and so they started out being kind of immersion-like and just rejecting any grammar instruction. Today they've kind of come back toward the middle. So where there's it's okay to teach grammar explicitly, or more often when possible implicitly, like you give them examples and try to get them to guess, and then you explain the grammar to them, but then you practice it in a meaningful way, some kind of activity that models what you might do in the language in a real environment. And you can take there's a TESOL class, or language teaching class in the English department you can take and learn about that more. One thing about L2 vocabulary, by the way, when it comes to learning in L2, let's say you're learning English as a second language, you learn bottle. Let's say if you're Korean, whereas it's byung. So at first you have two different representations in your mind, in your brain, for bottle and for byung. And the bottle, the L2 one, takes some practice and some exercise in order to develop those mental connections. And at first, though, they are, you have to go through your L1. Oh, what is bottle? Oh, byung. At first, you have to go through your L1, you have to translate because they're very closely connected. Your mental representation for bottle and for byung. After you get to some level of proficiency with the vocabulary, they start to kind of diverge, and you can go direct, if you're learning English as an L2, then you can go directly to bottle without having to first go through your L1. So over time, the vocabulary representations tend to diverge. But at first, you kind of translate because your L2 vocabulary is tied directly to your L1 vocabulary in your brain. Language anxiety. What are causes of language anxiety, and what are its effects? A lot of time to talk. What do you think causes language anxiety, and what are its effects? What do you think? Causes or effects of language anxiety. So you talked about it earlier. If you have language anxiety with, say, English as an L2 or with Korean as an L2, well, let's look a little bit at the psychology here. Causes and effects. Self-efficacy in psychology is it's sort of like a special type of self-confidence. Your self-confidence is actually a complex concept in psychology. And one component is self-efficacy. That's, are you confident in your ability to learn and master an academic subject or a skill? Do you feel confident about yourself? And it may relate to general overall confidence or overall learning efficacy. So do you feel confident in your ability to learn? And that confidence can be undermined if the learning environment is too perfectionistic or high stress or test driven, like very Sunan focused here. That can undermine your confidence, your motivation, and your sense of efficacy. And appraisal anxiety. You're worried about appraisal or evaluation. What do people think of me? Are my parents or my teachers or my classmates going to think I'm dumb? As well as the test anxiety. You're afraid of the test because the test results are going to give you negative feedback that will hurt your sense of self-esteem. Every little test with a bad score hurts your self-esteem and your self-efficacy and your self-confidence. You might have just general situational anxiety or general anxiety towards classroom environments for reasons like that, or it could be specific to the language or a particular classroom or a particular teacher. Teacher is really mean and awful, and I hate the language, or I hate the teacher, or I hate the course. So it could be particular classroom settings. Apprehension about communication, like for us trying to use Korean in the street and ask directions or do something in Korean, or for me yesterday, interacting with a doctor's office and I can't even hear what they're saying because of my ear, and trying to figure out what they're telling me at the doctor's office when I go in. Test anxiety, and again, you're worried about negative evaluations, like from the test, from the teacher, your grades, as well as what people think of you. You're worried about what people think of you. Or you're worried about what you think of yourself, especially if you're a perfectionist. Perfectionism is not good because you're worried about yourself. What do I think of myself? Am I smart? Am I good? Am I good enough? And so you tend to engage in avoidance strategies or defensive strategies. Forgetting things, you're avoiding. It could be a strategy for avoiding a face-threatening or esteem-threatening situation. Avoidance, forgetting things, being passive in class, not being active in class. I don't want the teacher to call on me. Not taking a class. Procrastination could be a defense strategy. You're putting off doing something where you're afraid of a negative evaluation, a bad grade, and you're worried about that reflecting negatively on you. So those could be avoidance strategies. If you have writer's block too, or things like that. So how would you describe your motivation? Well, oh sure, yes. I mean, there's literature on that. For example, racism against, say, certain immigrant communities in the U.S. And for me, okay, as a foreigner, I've experienced racism in Korea. Not as bad as some other people I know, but I have experienced racism, maybe subtle forms of racism. And that hurts my motivation. So definitely. My previous job, I worked in a different center on campus. I was a research professor, and all the other staff were Koreans. I was the only foreigner. And I was hired specifically because of my skills as a foreigner with an education background and language background. But pretty much all the staff excluded me socially. The full-time staff, they would go out to lunch together, not even bother to ask me. Or in days when we had to go out to lunch together because the director was there after our staff meeting, most of them except my director ignored me. Or some directors, I had 3 different directors, and one of them completely ignored me too. I had one director who's really good and included me, but other directors ignored me. And one day I asked a coworker, why is it that you're not asking me out to lunch? Did I do something wrong, or is it because I'm a foreigner? And she said, oh, it's because you're a foreigner. And after that, well, they started asking me out to lunch, but then they would just ignore me at lunch. Like, it was kind of a racist environment. And this is at Kode, not my department, but my current department is really good. I'm in the Gukja Hagwon, and also the English department is pretty good. I know the English department and the foreign language department treat their foreign faculty really well, but some other departments don't. And that affects your motivation, and that can create anxiety. Or one staff member I tried to talk to, he wouldn't even answer me, or actually 2 of them. One of them was overtly hostile toward me and would not answer me even when I tried to speak to her in Korean. Things like that. So yes, and that kills motivation, that breeds anxiety, and it's in a big affective filter. I should read the literature on that because I think that's been studied in some countries, like in the US. Going on to motivation, very quickly, you can have intrinsic or internal motivation, and that's when you really want to learn something. And of course, that means your study skills are more effective, and these are the people who do best in learning a language, if you have intrinsic motivation. you like it, you have a sense of autonomy or desire. I'm doing it because I want to. In college, I did German I don't know why, I just like it. I wanted to. I had an intellectual interest, a personal interest. For some people, a social interest. You want to kind of adapt to another culture and maybe sort of identify partly with a different culture. And as you progress, you're like, oh, I'm learning. I'm doing well. Get a sense of mastery or achievement. That feeds your self-esteem. And that feeds your intrinsic motivation. Mastery or achievement feeling. The opposite is extrinsic. You don't want to learn the language, but you have to. Like for some of you, you had to take English in high school. You had to take Hagwon classes. It's forced upon you. You don't want to do it. Do it because of reward. I'll get a good score, get into Kode. Avoiding punishment, I want to get into Kode, not Sagangde. Or I don't want people to think I'm dumb. I want those good test scores. I want to get a Kode. I want to get a good job. So it's totally external. Or even perfectionism, which is motivated by fear of negative evaluation. I want to feel good about, I want people to accept me and think I'm smart. I want to accept myself and think I'm smart and worthy. That's actually the basis of perfectionism, and it's very unhealthy. For some people kind of achieve this middle ground, a happy middle ground that's also helpful. It's like, I don't hate English. I don't really like it, but it's just useful because maybe I'm interested in business. I like business, I want to make money, I want to run a company, and everything about business is in English, so it's a useful tool. I like business, and so I don't mind English because it's a useful tool for learning about business, which is really what my thing is. So I don't mind it, and that can be a successful kind of motivation too, where it's like I like science, and English is, well, the language of science, so I don't mind learning English because I learn about science through English. That's the instrumental. Finally, demotivated, discouraged, and depressed, and you have lost all hope and all motivation. Language learning strategies. The success of strategies, especially if you have positive motivation. There are different classifications. I'll talk about the famous Oxford classification in English as a second language research. Cognitive associations, mnemonics. For example, I find it helpful to use memory tricks or memory devices, for example, in learning Korean. For example, Korean has, what is it, ge, and, can you say this? You have three ge's in Korean. How can I remember which one? Well, regardless of what it actually means in that particular word and what the Chinese origin is in that particular word, I will think of crab. So jipge, right? I think of a crab picking up a house with its claws. Ge, so like ge is crab. This ge is chicken or kemin chicken. So whatever. So any word with this, I can think of a chicken. Like there's the famous American cartoon chicken named Foghorn Leghorn. So imagine this chicken. He's signing a contract, ge yak, and for signing the contract, he's been given a bunch of drugs, yak. Or medicine, geyak. Okay, it's a mnemonic. This ge is dog, so gebal, which means to develop. I just imagine a dog developing extra legs or feet, bal. Bal is feet. So mnemonics. Thinking, metacognitive thinking consciously in evaluating your language learning, in your learning process. Oh, what do I need to do to learn this? How well am I doing? What do I need to focus on? Oh, I need to focus on this. And also kind of, along with this, maybe being kind of flexible. Some people are more patient, like if I don't understand this, I'm okay, I'll get it later. But some people are kind of frustrated, I don't understand this. I don't understand, I get frustrated. And so more cognitively flexible learners are kind of a little bit better if they, with ambiguity or not understanding something, and that's a helpful strategy. Like, oh, I don't understand this, but okay, I'll keep this in mind and I'll keep working on it. I'll get it, don't worry. I'll just focus on something else. Using contextual clues to compensate. Somebody says something to me in Korean, so I kind of guess on pragmatic cues or the parts of the sentences that I understand. Try to guess what they're trying to tell me. Managing your emotions and your attitudes and thinking about your motivation in learning. Is my motivation healthy? Is it intrinsic? or is it too extrinsic? Especially if you're an extrovert, seeking opportunities for practicing, seeking social situations for practicing the language. There's a lot here. So basically, seeking input, social input, but also seeking reading input, reading in the second language if you really want to master it, seeking also media materials on your own in the language, like songs and YouTube videos. That can be, all of that can be helpful for developing automaticity. We talked about automaticity last time, not only in terms of reading, but just in terms of thinking in the language and processing the language and be able to use the language without having to translate first. Thinking about cultural identity. Learning English as a second language doesn't mean you have to become Americanized. It could be more about, and that might cause resentment. I have to learn English, it's some American thing imposed upon us, and don't like that. Well, it's not just American, it's British, Australian, and people from many other countries study British or American English, and so it could be more of a global identity. It doesn't have to be specifically American or British in our attitudes towards English. We don't have time for questions, but I'll give you a Google form later on for questions, and again, on the last day of class I can entertain lots of your questions, so think of questions on this. So next week we'll get into psycholinguistics, and that'll be fun. All right, see you later.